Cool, everyone awake this morning? Oh, awesome, yeah, perfectly timed. Okay, cool. So, hi everyone, my name is Donna. I'm a design researcher at AppDirect. We're in the business of cloud software marketplace platforms, and this is my colleague.
I'm Isaac, a product designer at AppDirect.
Cool, and today we're excited to share with you a process that we've been developing to help build empowering style guides using research and design thinking methods. And when we say empowering, we mean usable and impactful. Usable for all of its users and impactful for the company. So in the case of style guides, the users for our style guides are designers, engineers, you guys, others. But we realized that after we weren't necessarily building our style guide with all of these users and their needs in mind.
And that's because our first attempt at creating a style guide was done in a silo. We created all of our styles in Photoshop. We thought out the elements, the components, went down to the atom level. But we did that only amongst product designers and didn't really talk to the engineering team to find out what are the needs that they'd have for a style guide. And so this was all done with talking to them, and implementation became a problem afterwards. And that's something we're still dealing with to this day. One of the realizations that we got from that is we probably should go talk to other people at other companies to understand what they're doing, what were the successes that they're having, and also failures, so that we can learn from that. So over the past 3 months, we've been interviewing designers, researchers, engineers, as well as PMs from different startups, mid and large-sized companies, to understand their experiences with style guide creation. And so many of the people that we interviewed said that their first attempts at creating a style guide were also done in silos. Either communication across teams didn't happen at all, or the few learnings that they did have were lost in translation. And so what that meant is that there was a misalignment of needs between these teams, and it caused a lot of teams to spin out into different directions. So a lot of the style guides that they created were either too technical for designers to implement, or not technical enough, didn't have enough specifications on use for engineers to implement and actually get into product. And this resulted in a lack of adoption for the style guide. Upon completion, many of these style guides, as we saw in the presentation before, were unusable, were basically put in the trash. They were not adopted. And since they were unusable for the intended users, we heard that a lot of common mistakes were that there was wasted time. So wasted time, wasted resources, all this effort was put in, and what came of it. And this added to negative sentiment about style guides at these companies in general after that.
Sound familiar? Nod with me. So this, as a researcher and a designer, this got us thinking about how we could use research and design thinking methods that we use in our day-to-day to help avoid these problems. So we're going to share with you the process that we've come up so far. So full disclosure, this process is in the process of being refined and tested and used, but we have circled back with the people we talk with, and they found it valuable, and the feedback has been great. So we hope that you will find something valuable from it as well as provide your feedback. So this process, we broke it down into a few steps. So first, discovering everyone you need to talk to what questions to ask them and how to gather that information, to starting to understand all the data, make sense of it, and see what the problems are at hand, to finally defining metrics, user stories, and principles that will help guide and track the success of our style guide. And as we go through, we'll talk to ways that you can do this as an individual, or that we're thinking of doing as individuals or as a team.
So the first step in our process is to discover all of the people that we need to talk to. A style guide is something that means different things to different people within your organization, and it's going to be our job to find out what it means to all these different people by talking to them. So we want to cast a wide net to discover everyone that's going to be affected by the style guide. And so we have a few recommendations for doing this. And the first thing is we wanted to break these groups down into three groups of people. Our first group is our users. These are the people, of course, that will be using our style guide. This will include designers and engineers, but this may also, at your companies or at our companies, include content strategists. It may include outside agencies and a slew of other people. The second group are our builders. These are the people that will be building our style guide. You'll see also designers in here again, and engineers. But in this instance, there's special things that we want to learn about them in this capacity, so it's important to ask them questions related to their builder aspect. And then the third group that we have are stakeholders. I'm sure we're all familiar with stakeholders if we're at companies, even consulting. So these people are people that we need to loop in during important decision making during the style guide process. This can include CEOs and design managers. And so basically, when you're creating these groups, just know that there may be overlap in the different groups, and that's okay. We can sort that out later. So as we're figuring this out and kind of talking with people, we wanted to give some tips to make it easier to categorize these people. We thought it would be easy to, of course I need to interview designers and engineers, but to really help people to figure out other people to interview, we came up with a set of a set of examples that we can help to brainstorm. So our first tip is we should consider current products that will be affected. So these are going to be current teams and people that are working on your product, and you'll want people that you want to interview. So as an example from AppDirect, we have a large set of product offerings, and so it'll be important for us to talk with product leads and architects to make sure that we take that into account. And as a second tip, we should consider products in the pipeline. So not just the things that we already know exist in our site, but products that are coming up in the future. So if our site is getting ready to go responsive, we'll want to talk with engineers that will be implementing that to make sure that our style guide is taking that into account. And then our final tip is that we should consider product-specific features and needs. So not everyone's style guide is going to contain the same. Some of the elements will be the same, of course, buttons and that sort of thing. But the way that we're going to present that may be different based on the needs of our company. So we want to figure out people and product experts within our company that know something that's important to us. So for example, with AppDirect, we allow our customers to theme our site within the use in their company. So for us, having themable elements is really important to our style guide, so we want to make sure that our code base and our styles reflect that.
Great. So now that we know who all should talk to, what questions do we ask them, and understandably from working on style guides with other people, you're asking a lot of questions of, like Brad said, is it this it? Is this it? How do you code this component? What color should this button be? But no one really, I think, from our experience and also from talking with others, took a moment to ask, what problems are we actually trying to solve with the style guide, and how can we build a style guide that's most impactful and usable for everyone involved? So these are the questions we want to focus on here. So going to the groups that Isaac just shared, users, the people who will be using our style guide, we want to cover 3 things when we're talking with them. So the first we want to cover is our problems. So what are your biggest points when it comes to working on tasks and projects related to styling? Second, you want to really drive and try to understand their goals, like from their perspective, how could a style guide be most impactful for them? And another way to ask this is, what would a style guide enable you to achieve? Third, you want to dig into usability. So what information do you need from a style guide, and how do you want this information presented? The key here is not to focus on the specific questions or the wording of the questions, is to really just do what you need to do to drive at these 3 goals. So builders, the people who will be helping to create your style guide, they'll be users most likely when it's all said and done, so you want to make sure to ask them the user questions as well. And then secondly, you want to shift focus and sort of focus on, from the perspective of a builder, what goals do would they have for the style guide from a builder perspective? From their perspective, what would make a successful style guide? And then secondly, uncover any requirements. So what are important factors that they feel like are important when building a style guide, and what constraints do they foresee, whether technical, design, or resource? Then for stakeholders, you want to ask about 2 things. So the first is their problems. What problems do they hope to solve with this style guide? And then their goals, what impact do they see for this style guide? And you'll probably hear things that other people have said, or it might be more high level, team level, company level. For yourself and your team, also make sure to ask yourselves the applicable questions and add them to the mix. So now that you've know what questions to ask, how do you gather all this data and gather in a way that makes it easier to refine later? And we have a few guidelines around that. The first is really try to have these interviews, if possible, face-to-face. Don't underestimate the power of a story, of being able to listen firsthand, dig in firsthand. Those stories, their pain points, their goals become like a persona in your brain, and they help with decision making down the road. So as you're interviewing people, take a lot of notes, and then after an interview, you want to pull out the nuggets. The nugget is something that really resonates with the things that we're trying to uncover, a pain point, a single concept, a single idea, and we find that it is best to transcribe them onto sticky notes in true design thinking fashion, because when it's in a movable form, that's how we found it easiest to process all that data. And then divide and conquer if it's too much for an individual, if you feel like you have a lot of people to talk to. But if you do divide and conquer, just make sure to share those stories back out briefly with the rest of the group, so everyone can have those stories and pain points and that persona in their brain, and that makes it so much easier for your team to move forward with a shared understanding.
Okay, so Donna walked us through the process of interviewing to find needs, ideas, and requirements. So how do we make sense of all of these findings? In this next phase, understanding, this is where we're going to use the process of clustering to bubble up the most important ideas and concepts and find basically problems. These problems are the problems that our style guide ultimately needs to solve for. We'll grab our sticky notes or our nuggets of information and we'll cluster them together. Some of these clusters will be very obvious to us, and some of them we'll need to use a little intuition for. We may kind of talk with our team and kind of figure that out together. I'm going to walk through a couple of examples so we can have an example of how to do this before we try it out. In our first example, I'm going to highlight two nuggets. The first thing we heard from a designer at a small startup. We spent a lot of time writing red lines for our designs. So that was one nugget. In another nugget, we have an engineer from a medium-sized company that said, I have to go through every single red line, and many of them are repetitive. So from this cluster of multiple nuggets, we're going to get to the problem statement. People are wasting time on repetitive tasks, and that's something that our style guide will want to think about. And here's two more examples. Let's see that I'll walk through. In our second cluster, two nuggets stand out. A designer from a large company said, I design components only to find out later that some of the solutions are not technically feasible. A second person said, from a large company said, a group of designers that are responsible for creating styles refuse to share their designs until they're 100% final. And so now I don't know what I'm supposed to make my mocks look like. From this cluster, we're starting to see the problem statement that information is siloed and not being readily distributed to all team members. And in our final cluster, a designer and engineer from a couple of large-sized companies said, engineers are creating one-off styles in the product instead of reusing existing code. And in the second nugget in this cluster, an engineer at a medium-sized company said, rogue designers are modifying component styles on the fly in their new designs. Here what we can see, we see a problem statement forming, which is inconsistent processes are resulting in an unwieldy and unsustainable code base. So we've walked through putting our nuggets together into clusters and kind of getting what the problem statement is. We define the problems that our style guide needs to address.
So now we have an idea of all the problems that our style guide could or needs to address. We were thinking, how can we turn these problems into something actual, into things that we can strive towards and actually measure how our style guide is doing. So we'll be defining three things: principles, user stories, and metrics. So first, principles and why principles. Well, typically the best way to combat problems is by setting goals, and this is what principle here is in this case. They help us reframe our problems into something that we can strive towards while we're creating our style guide. So how do we create principles for problem statements? Taking the example that Isaac shared earlier, where the problem statement was people are wasting time on repetitive tasks. Now let's ask ourselves then, what do we want to enable instead? If people are wasting time on repetitive tasks, we want to enable them to be more efficient, and that becomes our principle, efficiency. So let's walk through two other examples. From that one cluster, information was not being readily distributed to all teams. We want our style guide to enable transparency, and that could, be in the form of communicating why certain components are created a certain way, or letting other teams know what components are currently being worked on so they don't spin their wheels and create duplicate work. The third example, the problem being that because of inconsistent processes, rogue designers or engineers who are going off and doing one-off things, we have this unwieldy and unsustainable code base. So instead, we want consistency. And I like this example because it sort of gets us thinking about service design around a style guide. You can create a style guide, but what are the processes that you need to put in place in order to ensure the adoption and usage of your style guide? Here are some examples we can draw from, you can draw from as reference. And as you can see, you can state your principles as words or phrases or even sentences. It's whatever helps you and your team get on the same page about what you're striving towards. And once we have all of our principles down, we may want to prioritize them so that when we're making decisions along the way, we know what are the most important things we want to focus on down the road. The key here is now that we have high-level goals to aim for, and we can rest assured that we're aiming to solve the problems that we want our style guide to solve.
So in this section, we're going to take our principles and we're going to tie them back to the people that we interviewed earlier using user stories. I'll continue from our first example. The problem statement was, people are wasting time on repetitive tasks, and the principle that we defined was efficiency. To create a user story, I'll ask myself, or the team and I will discuss the following. How would a user define efficiency in a way that reduces time wasted on repetitive tasks? So specifically, what does a designer need to do to be efficient? What does an engineer need to do to be efficient? And then I'll craft user stories that read as following. As a designer, I need to quickly communicate basic elements of the page to an engineer so that I can be more efficient. As an engineer, I need to have access to clear instructions detailing how components are intended to be used so that I can be more efficient. From these user stories, we're able to see a potential solution would be to create a style guide with a shared language to communicate components between the team. And my team might want to clearly title components in a way that's easily referred to by everyone, designers and engineers included, and to really make sure that there's clarity about that title and those words to everyone.
Great, so now let's define metrics so that we can actually track the impact of our style guide. And we're going to use a mashup here of the principle and the user story. So here, for our principle of efficiency and the corresponding users from our user stories, designer and engineer, the way that we could frame this to get at what metrics to track would be to ask, so for example, as a designer, what does efficiency mean for me? At AfterRec, we track design tickets in Jira, so perhaps we could look at whether there's a decrease in the Jira story size or if there's a decrease in the number of QA tickets that come our way. And then for an engineer, we could see what does efficiency mean for them. That could be shorter code review or fewer GitHub changes or pull requests. This is also an opportunity we can take to look at metrics at a more product or project level. So perhaps the project has a shorter timeline, it's completed faster, or like the product velocity is faster. A bunch of examples of metrics that we are considering, and then hopefully it will help you as well. If you're finding it hard to pinpoint measurable, trackable things at your company, surveys can be a good substitute in this case. So, sending out a before and after, tracking the hours spent on a task, or asking, satisfaction questions like on a scale of 1 to 5, how useful has this style guide been for you? The key here is that having some data is better than no data, and that having multiple metrics per user story ideally is better than only one metric, because one metric gives you one perspective, but data is imperfect, it has bias. So the more metrics you track, the more fuller and accurate of a picture you have on the impact of your style guide.
So we've gone through 4 steps. We've gone through discovering our users, our builders, and stakeholders. We've gone through interviewing each of these groups, then clustering the information that we learned regarding their problems, and finally, we've gone through the process of defining principles, user stories, and metrics. And now we want to unveil a final result, what a final result might look like. So imagine at your team or with your company that this might be posted on a wall somewhere, on foam core, or even in a document somewhere.
And essentially what we've just walked you through and now created is a great map of all the problems, principles, user stories, and metrics relating to your style guide. So first, we know comprehensively all of the problems that our style guide can or needs to solve, and we've covered our bases by talking with everyone we need to talk to. Second, we now have principles to help us guide us. In the creation of our style guide, we've made our problems actionable. Third, we have user stories, so we know exactly what we're building and for who, and we know who we can go to check in to see if we're meeting their needs. And then fourth, Finally, we have metrics so that we can measure the impact of our style guide to see if we're actually solving the problems that we want to solve up front.
We believe that this tool will help people to understand and visualize their style guide needs, and just making that very clear to the entire team. It will lead in productive conversations regarding decision making, and it'll track that. And also, it'll help us to evolve the style guide over time. This isn't a process that we see just doing once and filing. This is a process as we add more styles, as teams change, that we can go back over again and just assess, and we can kind of scale to the size that we need depending on the resources we have access to. We define the ultimate mark of success for a style guide is that we're able to check off our user stories and make sure that we're answering to those, and that we're able to show that our metrics are being achieved. And we believe that if we're able to do that, we will have ensured that our style guide is empowering to our users and ultimately impactful for our company.
So thank you for listening. We will be sharing the slides on Twitter, so follow us.
And if you all do use this and you have any modifications that you make or questions or whatever, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear how this evolves. We're going to continue to evolve it.
We can do a handoff situation. Oh, that's okay. We're friends. For now. I like, God, there's so many things. This is I like the part where you said, and then you're like, thank you. Okay, next thing that I liked was, in part of the beginning of the talk, you've observed some situations in which a failure of a style guide led to negative sentiment towards style guides. Say you're at an organization, you tried to kick one through the door, and it just didn't take. It led to the slide where Brad had with all the Photoshop things in the trash can because it ditched because it wasn't solving any problems. And not only was it not used, which is a bummer, but maybe the worst problem is that that you can't ever try again because everybody who was involved with that has such like snake bitten now on style guides. I wonder if you could, was that a true story? Did that come from a real place, or do you want to talk about that for a sec?
Yeah, so we interviewed we actually did interview people, we didn't make them up, even though that might have made it easier. And we heard from smaller companies. So for example, one of the companies that we talked to was a small company, and they have about 40 people on the team, and they're on their third trial at making a style guide. The first one was created in InDesign, and of course the engineers did not use that at all. And so the engineering team said, hey, you know what, we're going to help you, we're going to create something, which none of the designers on this team were coders. So they never implemented it because they didn't want to ask the engineer every time to add stuff. So that was their experience. Definitely over my career, I've seen style guides, start and fizzle.
Okay. That's kind of sad. I bet there's a ton of that. I think that was kind of the chorus around style guides. Even 3 years ago, at least the people I was hearing from, was that style guides sound so nice, but they just never happen. Like people are angry about them almost because they try and they fail. But you honed in on they failed for a reason. They failed because you didn't you didn't involve all the right people or whatever, which is interesting. So part of that is what you call discover, which is interviewing the people who care about this thing, because it's not just like if you solve for just front-end developers, that doesn't actually solve anything, because the style guide is supposed to be solving for not just them, but all the people they communicate with as well. So probably the common two are designers and developers. That's the normal gap. So you have to solve kind of problems on both sides of the fence, right? I mean, maybe we could just, I don't know, does that feel right to you?
Oh, no, definitely. And I think what we've heard is common is you're going to have butting heads because everyone has needs and there's going to be a lot of needs. So I think the suggestion there would be coming from our good friend Dale, who's in that audience. Whoever this project manager for this style guide or whoever takes that role to gather all of those user stories, and then you're going to have to prioritize. You're going to have to make concessions to a certain degree, but just talk with people. It's easy. It's easy to certainly just talk with them. Yeah.
That InDesign story was great because it's kind of like that's so obviously solving for only one person's needs. Yeah. Okay, cool. So that, I mean, I called it the fence, but maybe we shouldn't call it the fence because the fence equals silos probably, or that's a lot of metaphors again going on in one thing. But the idea is don't just talk over the fence, but maybe kick it down or whatever. Is there more than just, there's not just designers and developers, but you mentioned like PMs and I don't know what all the titles are, site owners and stuff like that. They're part of it, maybe it's a triangle or something too, isn't it? Because maybe you've figured out a way to solve these problems on both sides. You'd be like, this is going to work for them, it's going to work for them, but it's also going to take 6 months. And that doesn't work for the PM, right? Because it's like, how much time, what's reasonable for pushing something like this out?
Yeah, I'm trying to put together in my mind a good analogy or metaphor for you. But I think, Brad said, sometimes you just have to do it. So I think for some people, like I know in the past at other startups, I've just gone ahead and started to create one and kind of work with the engineer that did like to talk with me about it, even if they weren't the lead engineer. And I also think of it as, when engineers are doing unit tests and that sort of thing, I'm not going to go into that language because I don't know it that well. That's something that doesn't necessarily show up in the product, but we know that it's going to make people more efficient. So if we can really talk about less of like the buttons and the stuff that's interesting to me as a designer, but more of the efficiency, time, like as we said with metrics, if we can talk to those things to people that don't understand our design language, we'll probably be more successful getting these things through.
And I think another thing from the research perspective is a lot of people are like, oh, we don't have time for research. Honestly, the research is talking with people. And I think sort of similar to what Brad said to get stakeholder buy-in, you can talk to people and write down a list of needs, and then you go to whoever is making that call on the timeline and be like, look, if we don't actually do it this way, engineers aren't going to use it. And that makes a case for trying to avoid wasted time down the line.
I really like the unit tests. That's good. You should give that to Isaac. The style guides are like unit tests for design, kind of? Yeah? That's tweetable, I feel like.
I'll take it.
Yeah. Well, it kind of is, because you're both sitting in the same room, and they're working away on some Jasmine test or something. You're like, what is that? That doesn't matter. That doesn't affect. And they're like, yes, it does. It makes sure that the JavaScript that I write doesn't break or whatever. And you're like, that's what this style guide does. I'm not wasting time either. It's making sure that the design we built doesn't break. It's the same thing. Love it. Very good. Cool. So measuring the impact was a big deal too. I'm glad that was brought up. I honestly hadn't thought of it all that much. It literally like, okay, we did this thing. How can we make sure that it was worth it? So what's one that you've met? I mean, there was a slide with like 50 measurements on it, but it's like, have you had experience with like, what's just like one that is a line that could go up after you've implemented?
Line that could go up. That's a good question. Well, at our company at least, a lot of things are tracked in Jira, so there's definitely a lot of metrics there that if you just do averages and just look across time, you can definitely see changes.
Cool. So like less tickets.
Yes.
That would be a pretty cool metric. Okay, well, thanks very much for talking with me and for your talk.
Thank you.